Welcome, my friends. Tonight, you and I will travel through a story that is more than just words. It's an experience, a journey into the shadows of medieval Europe, where death was a profession and survival was an art form rarely mastered. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you tucked away in your bedroom in New York at midnight? Perhaps you're in London, watching the early morning light creep through your curtains. Or maybe you're halfway across the world in Tokyo, stealing a quiet moment during your lunch break. I love knowing that we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united in our curiosity for the darker chapters of history. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this journey is going to be unforgettable. Tonight, we're diving deep into a world where honor was a luxury most couldn't afford, where a whispered name could be worth more than gold, and where the difference between success and death was often just a single heartbeat. So settle in, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that helps you focus. Get comfortable, because for the next few hours, we're going to explore together one of history's most misunderstood professions. We're going to peel back the Hollywood glamour and romantic myths to reveal the brutal, desperate reality of what it meant to be a medieval assassin. Tonight, we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not-so-glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys to change history with a blade and a whisper. While Hollywood makes them look cool, the truth is, being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. Think about every movie or video game you've ever seen featuring assassins. The sleek black outfits, the perfectly choreographed fights, the mysterious mentor who teaches ancient wisdom in a hidden monastery, the romantic tension with a beautiful noble who sees past the killer's dark exterior to the wounded soul beneath. It's all nonsense. Pure, romanticized nonsense that has about as much connection to historical reality as a fairy tale has to actual medieval peasant life. The real medieval assassin wasn't a mysterious warrior poet gliding through moonbeams with supernatural grace. He was more likely a desperate, half-starved criminal with terrible hygiene, questionable morals, and the kind of life expectancy that made childbirth look like a safe career choice. He didn't have a code of honor. He had empty pockets and no other options. He didn't train in ancient fighting techniques. He learned to kill the same way most people learned to swim in those days, by not drowning the first few times he tried it. But here's what makes their story fascinating, even tragic. These weren't inherently evil people for the most part. They were products of a world so harsh, so unforgiving, that killing for money became a rational career choice. They were the human debris of a social system that chewed people up and spat them out with such regularity that entire lives could vanish without anyone noticing or caring. Medieval Europe was a place where a single bad harvest could doom entire families, where political allegiances shifted like weather patterns, and where justice was something purchased by those who could afford it. In this environment, the assassin wasn't an aberration, he was inevitable, a natural byproduct of a civilization that ran on violence, hierarchy, and desperation. So as we journey together through their world tonight, remember this: we're not just learning about killers. We're learning about what happens to human beings when society fails them so completely that murder becomes their most viable profession. We're exploring the darkest corners of human adaptation, the places where morality goes to die and survival instincts take over completely. These were men, and occasionally women, who lived in the spaces between civilization's cracks. They existed in the shadows not by choice, but because the light had been denied to them. And their stories, brutal as they are, tell us something profound about the world that created them and about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and survive in conditions that would break us, most of us, before we even started. So let's begin this journey together into the shadows where history's forgotten souls learn to dance with death.
Let's be absolutely clear about one thing from the start. No one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins in the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Picture this. You're a peasant in 13th century Europe. Your family worked the same plot of land for generations, eking out a bare existence, but at least having a place in the world. Then comes a bad winter, followed by a worse harvest, followed by a lord who decides your taxes need to double because he's building a new chapel. Your father dies of a fever, your mother remarries a man who beats you, your older brother gets conscripted into a war nobody can explain, and you never see him again. By the time you're 16, you've been kicked off your land, branded a vagrant, and discovered that sleeping in ditches gets old really fast. You try honest work, hauling grain, cleaning stables, begging, but honest work barely keeps you alive, and sometimes it doesn't even do that. You steal bread and nearly lose a hand, you try to join a monastery and get turned away for lacking a dowry, you attempt to become a soldier and discover that the army already has plenty of cannon fodder, thank you very much. That's when someone notices you. Not your potential, not your character, but your desperation. Maybe it's in a tavern where you're nursing a single cup of weak ale, trying to make it last all evening. Maybe it's in an alley where you're sleeping rough. A well-dressed stranger slides up to you, someone who clearly eats regularly and owns more than one set of clothes. His voice is soft, his manner friendly, and his offer is simple. There's a problem that needs solving, and you look like someone who might be able to solve it. Most medieval assassins weren't mysterious loners trained in mountaintop temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with decent aim, or people so far off society's radar they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had a reputation for solving problems with violence, and could sneak into a tavern without being seen, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a coin purse across a table and whisper a name. And that name wasn't going to be a fun one. You weren't asked to take out Bob the quiet turnip farmer. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or someone with 12 bodyguards in a moat. The pay looked tempting when you hadn't eaten in 3 days, but the job itself was horrifying. By the time someone seriously considered it, though, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. The recruiting process itself was deliberately vague and menacing. Your potential employer never told you their real name or their real motivation. They paid you just enough to keep you interested, but not enough to make you independent. They tested your desperation by making you wait, sometimes for weeks, before giving you the full details. This wasn't kindness, it was psychology. They needed to be sure you were desperate enough to go through with it, but not so desperate that you'd betray them for a better offer. And let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, no evenings off with colleagues sharing war stories over drinks. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said, "Quiet eliminations by appointment." You couldn't tell people at the market what you did for a living. When someone asked you about your profession, you developed creative answers. traveling carpet salesman, itinerant holy man, specialist in pest control. The stains on your clothes? Just dye. Yes, dye. Nothing suspicious about dark brown stains that smell faintly metallic. You had to stay quiet, move fast, and never, ever tell anyone what you really did for a living. Especially not loudly over ale at the inn, because medieval taverns were basically gossip networks with alcohol, and loose tongues had a way of reaching the wrong ears faster than you could say public execution. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero of your own story. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live long enough to enjoy spending the coins you earned from your terrible new profession. Now let's burst the first myth wide open, and it's a big one that Hollywood has been selling us for decades. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational flute music playing softly in the background. There was no montage of gradually improving skills, no ancient master stroking his beard while dispensing cryptic wisdom, no moment of spiritual awakening when you finally understood the deeper meaning of your deadly craft. The reality was far more brutal and improvised. If you learned anything about being an assassin, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals who had spent years perfecting their craft. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction, the ability to climb quietly without sneezing at the wrong moment, and enough common sense to know which end of a knife did the cutting. Think about it practically. Who exactly was going to train you? There weren't assassin schools with curricula and graduation ceremonies. There wasn't a guild of professional killers offering apprenticeships with full benefits and advancement opportunities. The few people who were successful at this profession were far too smart to advertise the fact or take on eager students who might betray them to save their own necks. If you had military experience, congratulations. That meant you knew how to hold a knife properly and had probably seen enough violence not to freeze up at the sight of blood. If not, well, stabbing someone turns out to be fairly intuitive from a mechanical standpoint, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact and no angry mob chasing you through the streets, that took skill, or more commonly, just pure luck. There were no instruction manuals, no guild orientation meetings where they explained the finer points of infiltration and exit strategies, no safety briefings about the occupational hazards of your new career. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double, or where nobles typically kept their bedroom exits, or which servants were worth bribing and which ones would sell you out for a hot meal. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill at midnight, wondering if you just crept into the servants' quarters again instead of the Lord's chamber. You learned about timing while crouched in a storage room for 6 hours, listening to footsteps and trying not to sneeze from all the dust. You discovered the importance of escape routes when you found yourself trapped on the wrong side of a locked door with guards approaching and no clever plan to get out. Poison. Now, there was a subject that was pure trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the error part. Medieval toxicology wasn't a science, it was desperate chemistry mixed with folk wisdom and wishful thinking. Sometimes your concoction worked perfectly. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and developed a healthy suspicion of his soup. And sometimes, in a cruel twist of irony, you accidentally drank from the wrong cup and discovered firsthand just how effective your mixture really was. There was no medieval poison control hotline to call when things went wrong, no antidotes carefully prepared in advance, just hope, herbal guesswork, and a prayer to whatever gods you still believed in that you'd gotten the dosage right. Many would-be poisoners ended up killing themselves through sheer inexperience, which solved the problem of loose ends, but hardly counted as a professional success. Sure, if you were extraordinarily lucky, and I mean winning the lottery while being struck by lightning lucky, you might have picked up some useful skills from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe an older, more experienced killer took pity on you and showed you how to walk on cobblestones without making noise, or taught you which shadows actually hid you and which ones just made you think you were hidden. But mentoring wasn't standard practice in this business. It was rare and short-lived, mostly because assassins don't retire to comfortable cottages where they can write their memoirs. They disappear, usually permanently, and rarely in circumstances that allow for peaceful transfers of knowledge to the next generation. Weapons training? Forget about it. You weren't carrying a broadsword into battle like some kind of medieval action hero. You had a dagger you'd stolen off a dead guard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else you could conceal under your cloak without making telltale metallic sounds when you walked. So, no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master with decades of training and ancient techniques passed down through generations. You were a desperate person with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with dark alleyways and shadowy corners. Your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies, just bruises, bloodstains, and the growing realization that you were completely on your own in this terrible new world. Let's talk about the heart of the matter: money. Cold, heavy, jangly, deliciously spendable coin. The promise of wealth is what got most people into this miserable profession in the first place. But the reality of assassin economics was a masterclass in disappointment and betrayal. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term business relationship. They're not looking for a reliable contractor they can call upon repeatedly for various projects. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, no receipts, and ideally no witnesses, including you. The fundamental business model of assassination is built on the elimination of liability, and unfortunately for you, you are the biggest liability of all. The typical negotiation went something like this. A mysterious figure approaches you in a tavern, an alley, or some other suitably dramatic location. They offer you a substantial sum, let's say a pouch of silver coins that represents more money than you've seen in months. Half now, they say generously, half when the job is done. If they're feeling particularly magnanimous, they might even throw in some additional incentives: safe passage out of the city, letters of transit, or protection from certain enemies. But here's the thing about that phrase, "when the job is done." It's medieval code for after we verify you didn't mess it up, or make us look bad, or leave a trail that leads back to us, or survive long enough to tell anyone about our arrangement. In other words, it's code for never. So you take the job. You spend days or weeks planning, risking your life gathering intelligence, bribing servants, studying patrol patterns, and dodging guards. You sneak through shadows that smell like human waste and rotting food. You risk discovery, torture, and public execution. Maybe you actually manage to kill the target. Not pretty, not poetic, just a quick thrust of steel in the dark, followed by the sickening reality of what you've just done. And when you return to collect your payment? Yes, about that second half. Terribly sorry, but there's been a complication. I've had to leave town suddenly. Family emergency, you understand. But don't worry, I'll be in touch. Or worse, they try to kill you outright. After all, a knife to the gut is significantly cheaper than a bonus payment, and dead assassins don't blackmail their former employers. Even when you did manage to get paid, a miracle in itself, it was never quite enough compensation for the risk involved. Not for the blood on your hands, not for the weeks of sleepless nights listening for footsteps, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas, moral regret, and the growing certainty that you'd chosen the wrong profession. You got a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a reminder that you were never there. The conversation never happened. The target died of natural causes, political rivals, or divine judgment, anything except a hired killer with your particular set of skills and moral flexibility. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Some contracts were completely fake, elaborate political traps designed to eliminate you rather than the supposed target. You'd be told to assassinate someone dangerous, only to discover it was a decoy surrounded by guards who'd been expecting you. Congratulations, you'd just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. The client was actually working for your intended victim, and you were the real target all along. And even when the deal was legitimate, you couldn't exactly take your grievances to court if things went wrong. Your Honor, I'd like to file a complaint for breach of assassin contract. The defendant failed to pay the agreed-upon sum for services rendered in the elimination of Lord Edmund. The only court you'd see would be the one where you were the main exhibit, probably hanging from a gibbet as a warning to others. This taught smart assassins, the few who survived long enough to learn, to demand payment up front, trust absolutely no one, and always have an escape plan that didn't rely on their employer's goodwill. Some developed elaborate systems of dead drops and coded messages to avoid face-to-face meetings where they might be recognized or killed. Others worked exclusively through intermediaries, adding layers of protection and deniability that also unfortunately added opportunities for betrayal and payment disputes. The economics of medieval assassination were fundamentally broken from the start. It was a profession built on broken promises, vanishing clients, and the constant threat that your next job might be your last, not because of the target, but because of the person paying you to kill them. So yes, you learned to take what you could get, demand cash up front whenever possible, and never ever trust the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. He was right about that part though. It would change your life, mostly by shortening it considerably. So you've taken the job, been lied to about the pay, and accepted that you're probably going to die. Now let's talk about gear and prepare yourself for another crushing disappointment. Forget everything you've seen in fantasy novels and action movies. There were no retractable wrist blades that popped out with a satisfying click, no smoke bombs that created dramatic cover for your escape, no enchanted daggers that glowed in the presence of enemies, and definitely no crossbows that folded neatly into your boot for easy concealment.
Here's where the job description gets really interesting. Medieval assassins weren't hired to eliminate random drunks in back alleys or settle personal disputes between merchant families. No one was paying you good money to stab Jeff, the sleepy candle maker, because he'd been overcharging for beeswax. Your targets were important people, nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And those individuals weren't just hard to kill, they were practically impossible to reach. First, let's talk about the guards. Not one or two bored sentries nodding off at their posts, but dozens of professional soldiers, armed, armored, well-fed, and highly motivated to keep their employers breathing. Some guarded the obvious entrances, the main gates, the front doors, the ceremonial approaches that everyone could see. Others watched the less obvious access points, servant entrances, garden gates, the small doors that led to kitchens and storage areas. And then there were the guards who just stood around looking intimidating, their primary job being to make potential threats think twice about even attempting anything stupid. These weren't peasant conscripts with rusty swords. They were career soldiers who understood that their continued employment and continued existence depended entirely on their ability to keep their lord alive and unperforated. You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, memorizing patrol patterns. When did the guards change shifts? Which ones were diligent and which ones occasionally slacked off? How many steps did it take before the night watchman with asthma needed to pause for breath? Where were the blind spots in their coverage, and how long did those gaps last? It was like studying for the world's deadliest examination, where failure meant public execution rather than just a poor grade. Second, there were the physical defenses. Castles and manor houses weren't designed with convenience in mind. They were built as military installations where every architectural feature was intended to kill or deter attackers. These places didn't have welcoming front porches. They had gatehouse complexes with multiple layers of defense,
murder holes strategically positioned to rain death on intruders, and moats filled with things that would happily bite chunks out of anyone foolish enough to attempt a midnight swim. If you somehow managed not to fall into the water and drown, you still had to worry about archer slits, narrow openings that allowed defenders to shoot at you while remaining protected, and the ever-popular boiling oil treatment. Yes, actual boiling oil, heated specifically for the purpose of discouraging uninvited visitors. Your job description literally included the phrase, "may be set on fire for attempting unauthorized entry." Third, there were the servants and household staff, cooks, scribes, stable boys, chambermaids, gardeners, and dozens of other people whose livelihoods depended on the continued health and happiness of their employer. These weren't your allies. They were an early warning system with legs. One suspicious look from you, one wrong answer to a casual question, one moment of behavior that didn't fit your cover story, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just the new herbalist." Medieval servants were masters of observation and gossip. They had to be, because understanding the moods, preferences, and potential threats to their employers was literally a matter of survival. And assassins weren't just fighting against swords and armor, they were fighting against an entire network of people whose job it was to notice when something didn't belong. And finally, there was your actual target, the person you'd been hired to kill. These individuals weren't just randomly paranoid, they had excellent reasons for their suspicious nature. They were surrounded by political rivals, relatives with competing claims to their titles and wealth, and dozens of people who smiled to their faces while plotting their downfall. They lived in a world where poison was a legitimate political tool and where anyone could be a potential threat. They didn't eat food without having it tested first by dedicated food tasters, whose job was to die instead of them if something was wrong with the meal. They didn't sleep without multiple locks on their doors, bars on their windows, and guards stationed outside their chambers. Some even slept in different rooms each night, like a deadly version of musical chairs, making it impossible to predict where they'd be at any given time. Getting invited to a feast wasn't necessarily an opportunity. It was often a trap. Yes, your target might be drunk and vulnerable, but they'd also be surrounded by 50 witnesses holding tankards, 36 guards with their hands on their sword hilts, a handful of very alert jesters whose job included watching for threats, and at least 2 dogs trained to detect unusual scents or suspicious behavior. Even getting close to your target could take weeks of careful preparation. You might need to pose as a servant, which required learning the names of the other staff, understanding the household routines, and somehow acquiring the right clothing and documentation. You might need to bribe a chambermaid, which was expensive and risky since she could easily take your money and then report you for attempting bribery. When the moment finally came, your one shot, your single opportunity to complete the mission, you had to be perfect. One precise, silent, non-squeaky, completely undetectable strike, followed by an immediate and flawless disappearance into the night. Or you'd become the next cautionary tale, swinging from the castle gate with a sign reading, "Nice try, but not quite good enough." When you picture a medieval assassin, your mind probably conjures up images of sleek black clothing, leather bracers, maybe a mysterious hood that billows dramatically in the moonlight. The reality was far less cinematic and infinitely more pathetic. You looked like a sick goat herder with something to hide, and that was when you were having a good day. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high fashion or sophisticated theatrical productions. You didn't have access to custom-tailored cloaks, retractable armor, or professional makeup artists who could transform your appearance with clever prosthetics and stage magic. You had whatever clothing you could scavenge, steal, or borrow, and it usually came with the previous owner's distinctive aroma still attached. Your wardrobe might include peasant rags that were 2 sizes too big and had seen better decades, a monk's habit that made you look like you were playing dress-up in your older brother's clothes, or the remains of a guard uniform that definitely still carried the distinctive scent of its former occupant, assuming you were lucky enough to find one that didn't have suspicious stains or arrow holes. The primary goal was to blend in with the local population, but blending in medieval times meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, walked with a limp from old injuries and chronic malnutrition, and had developed a nervous twitch from spending their days wondering where their next meal was coming from. You didn't look suspicious because of your mysterious cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept unconsciously adjusting your belt to better conceal the dagger wrapped in cheesecloth that you'd hidden there. Face coverings presented their own unique challenges. There weren't multiple convenient options for concealing your identity. Most face coverings would make you look like a leper, which was excellent for avoiding casual conversation and social interaction, but absolutely terrible for gaining entry to parties, religious ceremonies, or anywhere else you might need to go to complete your mission. If anyone asked you who you were, and they would ask, because strangers were noticed and remembered in medieval communities, you had to think fast and lie convincingly. "Oh, I'm Brother Tobias. I specialize in silent prayer and rooftop maintenance." The key was to sound boring and slightly religious, since most people wouldn't ask too many follow-up questions about tedious ecclesiastical duties. But even assuming you successfully made it past the initial guards and gate sentries, noble households weren't staffed by complete idiots. The servants in particular noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones who fumbled with basic tasks, didn't know the names of the other staff members, or couldn't properly identify the cook's cat when asked. You were always just one "I've never seen you around here before" away from being enthusiastically clubbed with a candlestick by suspicious kitchen staff. And if your disguise actually worked, congratulations, you achieved a minor miracle. You still had the challenge of maintaining your false identity for hours at a time while surrounded by genuinely stab-worthy people who were walking around completely unaware of your presence and murderous intentions. You had to resist the urge to stare at your target, avoid drawing your attention to yourself through nervous behavior, and somehow complete your mission without arousing suspicion. Let's talk about wigs for a moment, because this is where medieval technology really let you down. They didn't exist, not in any practical sense for disguise purposes. If you needed to look significantly older or younger than your actual age, you were stuck with smearing dirt strategically on your face, practicing an elderly squint, and hoping that no one got close enough to notice that your gray beard was actually attached with honey and wishful thinking. Hair dye existed in very primitive forms, but the results were unpredictable and often temporary. You might attempt to darken your hair with plant-based concoctions, only to discover that rain turned your disguise into an embarrassing, streaky mess that made you look like you'd been dunked headfirst in a mud puddle. The brutal truth was that your disguise didn't actually protect you in any meaningful way. At best, it bought you maybe 5 minutes of initial confusion while people tried to place your face or remember where they'd seen you before. After that brief window, you had to rely on being genuinely invisible, extraordinarily persuasive, or very, very good at running away. And if anyone managed to see through your carefully crafted false identity, the consequences were immediate and severe. No one wanted to be the assassin caught hiding in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and gripping a sword, especially during a major religious festival when the place was crawling with actual clergy who definitely knew what real nuns were.
If being a medieval assassin wasn't already miserable enough, poor, constantly hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled permanently of goat, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative paranoia of the people around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared as dangerous criminals. They were considered cursed, unholy, touched by supernatural forces that decent people couldn't understand or defend against. To the average medieval peasant, you weren't just a killer in a dark hood. You were some kind of unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared mysterious substances on your blade under the light of a full moon.
Why else would you be able to sneak past trained guards and vanish into the darkness like smoke? Logic wasn't exactly a popular concept in medieval times, but superstition? Oh, that was everywhere, thick as morning fog and twice as persistent. Some people genuinely believed that assassins could shapeshift, taking the forms of animals or other people to infiltrate their target's defenses. Others claimed you were essentially invisible unless someone doused you with holy water first. One particularly popular tale suggested that assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could literally breathe death through solid walls. Imagine walking through a village and overhearing a woman mutter to her companion, "Don't make eye contact with that one. He might hex the baby just by looking at us." Your very presence was considered a contamination that could bring bad luck, disease, or supernatural retribution to anyone who crossed your path. Even your tools and possessions were viewed with supernatural dread. Carrying a dagger? Clearly it was forged in a cursed forge by demonic blacksmiths. Using poison? That wasn't chemistry or herbalism, that was pure witchcraft. And you probably stirred your deadly concoctions with a severed toe under a blood moon while chanting in languages that predated human civilization. You might think this widespread fear would actually help you in your work. After all, if people were terrified to even look at you directly, they'd probably stay out of your way and avoid asking inconvenient questions about your business. But the reality was much worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate when they believe they're confronting supernatural evil. They don't ask questions or demand evidence. They throw stones, set fires, and shout things like, "Burn him before he calls down lightning on the whole village." Your reputation for supernatural danger made people overreact to your presence in the most violent possible ways. The second someone died unexpectedly in any town you'd pass through, from illness, accident, or something as mundane as choking on a chicken bone, someone would inevitably whisper, maybe it was a shadow man, maybe it was him. You could be hunted and persecuted just for existing in the same general area as any suspicious death, regardless of whether you'd had anything to do with it. This meant you had to keep moving constantly. Stay too long in any location, and suddenly a priest would be ringing the church bell while 5 angry farmers appeared wielding pitchforks like they'd been waiting their entire life for this exact moment. And heaven help you if you were caught carrying anything even remotely unusual. Dried herbs for perfectly legitimate purposes? Clearly ingredients for dark magic. Strange coins from foreign lands? Obviously payment from demonic forces. Even speaking with a foreign accent was enough evidence for someone to shout "sorcerer" and light a torch with enthusiastic mob approval. In a world that genuinely believed monsters wore human faces and walked among decent people, being too quiet, too clever, or too fast made you an automatic threat. And according to medieval logic, supernatural threats had to be eliminated quickly, and preferably while on fire, because fire purified evil, and everyone knew demons were vulnerable to holy flames. The irony was that this supernatural fear that surrounded medieval assassins wasn't just an occupational hazard, it was a prison made of other people's imaginations, and the bars were reinforced with centuries of religious terror and folk wisdom about the dangers of trusting anyone who moved too quietly through the world. Ah, poison, the assassin's weapon of supposed elegance and sophistication. A quiet kill, no mess, no screaming, no steel grinding against bone. Just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. At least that was the theory that made poison seem like the perfect tool for a professional killer who valued subtlety over brute force. In practice, however, Poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight using nothing but herbal tea and a deeply unpleasant attitude. It was far more complicated, unreliable, and dangerous than any romantic notion of assassination would suggest. First and foremost, medieval poisons simply weren't reliable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or neat little pills conveniently labeled fast-acting doom. What you had instead was plants, mushrooms, minerals, and maybe the occasional toad, all of which required careful gathering, precise grinding, and a great deal of hopeful prayer that you'd gotten the preparation right. Even when you managed to create something genuinely toxic, it might just give your target a stomachache and a renewed commitment to employing an even larger anti-assassination guard team. The gap between mildly unpleasant and actually lethal was surprisingly narrow and nearly impossible to judge without extensive experimentation that you couldn't afford to conduct. There was no scientific measurement system, no precise dosing guidelines, no quality control standards. You eyeballed everything and hoped for the best. A pinch too little and your target would just vomit dramatically and cancel the rest of their dinner plans. A pinch too much and you might die from exposure to your own creation before the first course was even served. Medieval kitchens, meanwhile, were chaotic, crowded, and constantly supervised environments where you couldn't just waltz in and casually season the soup with nightshade while humming a cheerful tune. You had to either bribe someone already working in the kitchen, impersonate a cook convincingly enough to fool people who worked with food professionally, or somehow sneak in during the brief moments when no one was watching. Worst of all, you might spend weeks preparing to poison a meal that would ultimately pass through 3 different food tasters and a dog before ever reaching your intended target. Yes, an actual dog, because medieval nobles treated their meals like military operations that required multiple layers of security screening. If your victim was sufficiently important, they didn't just eat food, they treated it like it was trying to kill them, which in your case, it actually was. Meals were tasted by professionals whose job was to die instead of the noble if something was wrong. They were blessed by priests who called upon divine protection. They were sniffed and examined by everyone from the chief steward to the court jester. By the time the food actually reached your target's plate, it had passed through more security protocols than a royal wedding. Getting poison past that gauntlet required either incredible luck or access to someone very high up in the food preparation chain, which was expensive, risky, and likely to get you betrayed for the reward money. Even assuming you managed all of this, you successfully slipped the poison into the meal, it wasn't detected by any of the security measures, and your target actually consumed a lethal dose. The next phase was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took effect in minutes, others took hours, and some took days to work their way through the victim's system. One minute, your target might be laughing at a joke, and the next minute they could be clutching their stomach and demanding to see their personal astrologer for spiritual guidance about their sudden illness. The timing was completely out of your control, which made planning your escape essentially impossible. And if your target somehow survived the poisoning attempt, which happened more often than you'd expect, because medieval people were surprisingly resilient, guess who they would immediately blame? Not the cook who prepared the meal, not the food taster who was supposed to detect these things. You, the quiet stranger with apparent herbal knowledge and distinctly twitchy eyes who'd been lurking around the castle recently. Poisoning wasn't efficient, elegant, or reliable. It was risky, slow, and full of variables that were completely outside your control, none of which worked in your favor.
And if you were caught in the act of attempting to poison someone, you weren't looking at a quick execution. You were looking at being interrogated with medieval torture devices until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to his favorite hunting dog, whether you'd done it or not. The romantic image of the sophisticated poisoner who eliminated targets with subtle, untraceable substances was largely a fantasy. The reality was a desperate person with limited resources trying to kill someone using unreliable plant matter and hoping they wouldn't accidentally kill themselves in the process. It was amateur chemistry conducted under pressure by people who didn't understand the science behind what they were attempting, and the results were about as predictable as you'd expect. You'd think that if you successfully changed the course.
By now, you've probably figured out the central truth about medieval assassination. It wasn't darkly romantic like the movies suggest. It wasn't noble or honorable like some twisted form of justice. It wasn't even particularly profitable when you factored in the life expectancy and ongoing expenses of constantly fleeing from people who wanted to kill you. It was a grim, thankless, brutally short-lived career wrapped in blood-stained linen and followed by an ever-growing crowd of people who wanted you dead for a variety of excellent reasons. And you, sitting there in your comfortable modern life, perhaps imagining how you might have fared in such circumstances, you wouldn't last. Not a week, maybe not even a day. Because you'd start with all the wrong assumptions about what the job actually required and what kind of person could survive in that environment. You'd imagine that you'd be sleek and in control, a whisper in the dark who moved with supernatural grace and precision. But what you'd really be is cold, constantly hungry, and perpetually one bad guess away from swinging by your neck from the nearest convenient tree. You'd slip into your target city with your cloak pulled tight, feeling ready for action and confident in your abilities, only to discover that your intended victim had moved to a different location 3 days ago. The guards you'd planned to avoid were drunk but trigger-happy, which made them unpredictable rather than easy to bypass. And the stable boy you'd paid for crucial information had immediately sold you out to the authorities in exchange for a hot meal and a mug of ale, because his loyalty lasted exactly as long as it took someone to offer him something better. You'd freeze up at exactly the wrong moment, paralyzed by the reality of what you were attempting to do. You'd stab the wrong person in the confusion and darkness. You'd get spotted by someone's alert maid who remembered seeing your face near the chapel earlier that day and whose excellent memory was about to get you killed. And suddenly, instead of being a mysterious shadow, you'd become the problem that everyone was trying to solve. Guards would be chasing you, priests would be blessing weapons specifically to use against you, and every citizen would be looking for the stranger who'd brought murder and chaos to their peaceful community. Then what? You'd run, naturally, but you wouldn't be prepared for medieval terrain and urban landscapes. The thick mud that grabbed at your feet and slowed your escape, the uneven cobblestones that could turn an ankle if you weren't careful, the absolutely bewildering number of loose chickens, pigs, and other livestock wandering through the streets at the worst possible moments. You'd slip, fall hard enough to knock the wind out of yourself, and get tackled by a guard named Thomas, who'd recently been dumped by his girlfriend and was looking for someone to take his frustrations out on. And let's say you somehow survived that encounter and managed to escape immediate capture. Then you'd have to deal with the long-term consequences. No allies who were willing to risk their own lives to help you. No honor or respect from anyone who learned what you'd tried to do. No future worth planning for. Just whispers following you wherever you went, gradual suspicion from everyone you encountered, and the gradual realization that even if you somehow succeeded at your mission, the best you could hope for was to die old and alone, hiding behind a false identity in some remote village that still believed in fairies and witches. So no, you wouldn't last in the medieval assassination business. And frankly, you shouldn't even try, because the profession wasn't a path to power or respect or financial security. It was a cruel machine specifically designed to chew people up and spit out nothing but shadows and regrets. It offered the illusion of power without any accompanying peace, a sense of purpose without any real place in the world where that purpose could be safely exercised. You didn't make history through assassination. You erased yourself from it, becoming a footnote that most people were afraid to read too carefully. And the only thing waiting for you at the end of that dark path was silence. A silence that no one would question and no one would investigate, because by the time you reached that final quiet, no one would even remember that you'd ever been there in the first place. The medieval assassin's life wasn't cool, mysterious, or romantic. It was a trap disguised as a profession, and once you stepped into it, the only way out was through death or disappearance so complete that it amounted to the same thing. Now that we've spent time in the shadow world of medieval assassins, those desperate souls who killed for coin and died for their troubles, let me take you to a different kind of darkness. A darkness that wore silk instead of rags, that commanded armies instead of hiding from them, that shaped empires instead of merely ending individual lives. We're leaving behind the alleyways and hovels where assassins scurried like rats and stepping into the marble halls of ancient Macedonia, where a woman named Olympias proved that sometimes the most dangerous killer in the room is the one wearing a crown. But before we dive into her story, let's pause for a moment. Take a breath. We've been walking through some pretty grim territory together, exploring the brutality of a profession that Hollywood has turned into fantasy. I hope you're still with me, still comfortable in whatever corner of the world you're watching from. Are you getting tired? Need to stretch? Maybe grab some water or adjust that fan. We're going to shift gears now, moving from the individual desperation of hired killers to the grand political violence of royal courts, from people who killed to survive to a woman who killed to ensure her bloodline would rule the known world. The scale is different, but the human darkness we're about to explore is every bit as chilling. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, before she became one of history's most ruthless political operators, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a Molossian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself, and whether or not the blood of heroes truly ran in her veins, one thing was absolutely certain. This was not a woman born for the sidelines of history. From a young age, she was steeped in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not just by conventional politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic religious rites, and a deep reverence for the ancient gods that most civilized Greeks had begun to treat as mere stories. She wasn't the type of princess who spent her days smiling pleasantly and embroidering decorative tapestries for the palace walls. No, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and called upon divine forces in states of religious trance that civilized people found deeply disturbing. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative or political. It was intensely personal and probably genuine. She didn't merely worship the ancient deities, she embodied them, channeled them, spoke for them in ways that made grown men uncomfortable and suspicious. According to ancient sources, likely written by men who were both terrified and enthralled by her power, she kept sacred snakes in her private chambers and even allowed them to coil beside her while she slept. Whether this was literal fact or the kind of slanderous rumor that powerful women attract like flies to honey, we'll never know for certain. But the story stuck, became part of her legend, shaped how both allies and enemies thought about her. To her supporters, it made her divine, touched by supernatural forces that ordinary mortals couldn't understand. To her enemies, it made her dangerous in ways that conventional political opposition couldn't match. Her real power began not in a battlefield or throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight among the whispered conversations of priestesses and the sinuous movements of sacred serpents. She wasn't just a princess seeking political advantage. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something far older than politics and infinitely more dangerous than conventional royal intrigue. So when Philip II of Macedonia, brutal, brilliant, politically ruthless, and famously promiscuous, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation ceremony, he didn't just encounter a beautiful foreign princess looking for a politically advantageous marriage. He met a mystery he couldn't resist, a woman who represented forces he couldn't fully understand or control. Their eventual marriage wasn't just a political alliance designed to strengthen Macedonia's position relative to neighboring kingdoms. It was a collision between prophecy and raw political power, between the old mystical world of gods and omens and the new practical world of military conquest and territorial expansion. And from the very beginning, their relationship was saturated with supernatural signs and portents. Some witnesses claimed lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Others reported that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb, followed by visions of flames dancing around her unborn child without burning him. All of these stories would eventually become legendary, woven into the mythology that surrounded her son's rise to power. But one thing is historically certain. The union of Olympias and Philip II didn't just create a child. It created Alexander the Great, and she intended to shape his destiny from his very first breath, using every tool at her disposal, political, military, and supernatural.
With Philip dead and Macedon plunged into political chaos, Olympias moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a predator who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. While others scrambled to understand what had happened and what it might mean for the future of the kingdom, she acted with decisive, ruthless clarity. First on her list was Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen whose existence represented an ongoing threat to Alexander's legitimacy and future rule. According to the chilling historical accounts that survive, Olympias didn't simply order a quick, merciful death. She crafted something far more symbolic, public, and psychologically devastating. Some sources claim that Cleopatra was forced to watch her infant daughter be murdered before being compelled to hang herself in despair and shame. Others suggest that Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre while still alive, turning the execution into a grotesque religious ritual. What all accounts agree upon is this: no mercy was shown, no quarter given, no loose ends left untied. Olympias understood what many royal mothers throughout history failed to grasp until it was too late. In the brutal mathematics of dynastic politics, mercy toward rival claimants was not just a luxury, it was a potentially fatal liability. A rival child, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, represented a future war, a future challenge, a future threat that would eventually have to be dealt with anyway. And Olympias had decided she was permanently finished with playing defensive politics. She was done reacting to threats and challenges. It was time to eliminate them entirely. With Cleopatra and her bloodline systematically erased from the political landscape, Olympias could turn her full attention to securing Alexander's path to the throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, already trained by Aristotle in philosophy, politics, and military strategy, was declared king of Macedon without serious opposition from the noble families or military commanders. But observers would be making a serious mistake if they attributed this smooth transition solely to Alexander's personal charisma, his father's legacy, or the natural order of royal succession. The reality was far more calculating and deliberate. Olympias knew exactly which generals needed to be threatened with mysterious consequences if they opposed her son's rise to power. She understood precisely which noble families could be flattered, bribed, or intimidated into supporting the new regime. She had spent years mapping the political landscape, identifying potential enemies, and cultivating the relationships necessary to eliminate opposition before it could organize itself. She wasn't just protecting her son's rise to power. She was actively engineering it, pulling strings from behind the throne like a master puppeteer who understood that the real power lay not in wearing the crown, but in controlling the person who did. Alexander himself didn't always approve of his mother's methods. Historical sources suggest he disapproved of the extreme violence inflicted on Cleopatra's family, finding it excessive and potentially damaging to his reputation as a just ruler. But he also didn't try to stop it, because at some level he understood what Olympias had always known. Power in the ancient world demanded blood, and royal bloodlines were simultaneously a blessing and a curse. With her son now securely established as King of Macedon, Olympias began to recede slightly from the most visible aspects of public political life. But this apparent withdrawal was strategic theater, not genuine retirement from the game of power. She simply shifted her approach from open political strikes to whispered influence, from direct confrontation to subtle manipulation. As Alexander prepared to launch his ambitious conquest of the Persian Empire, the grand campaign that would eventually make him one of history's most famous military commanders, she remained behind in Macedon. But she wasn't functioning as a passive queen mother content to embroider tapestries and tend gardens. She had positioned herself as the spiritual guardian of his destiny, the mystical force that would ensure his success through supernatural means as much as military strategy. She sent him sacred relics blessed in ancient temples, consulted oracles to divine favorable timing for major military decisions, and performed religious rituals on his behalf to maintain divine favor and protection. To Olympias, her son's mission wasn't merely a military campaign aimed at territorial expansion and political conquest. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, the manifestation of divine will working through human instruments. Alexander wasn't simply going to war against the Persian Empire. He was carrying out the commands of the gods themselves, fulfilling the mystical destiny that had been foretold in dreams and omens since before his birth. And as long as she drew breath, no rival, whether Macedonian, Persian, Egyptian, or from any corner of the known world, would be permitted to derail that sacred plan. She had crowned her son through blood and political manipulation. She had cleansed the palace of threats through calculated violence. Now she would guard his empire from behind the scenes, watching with the patient eyes of a serpent coiled in shadows, ready to strike at anyone foolish enough to threaten her divine Alexander. As Alexander marched eastward to conquer the known world, establishing an empire that would stretch from Macedonia to India, Olympias remained behind as much more than a decorative queen mother collecting tribute and tending to domestic affairs. She had transformed herself into an unofficial but extremely powerful regent, ruling Macedon in all but name, while maintaining the fiction that others held official authority. Though regency was technically handed to Antipater, one of Alexander's most trusted and experienced generals, Olympias refused to be marginalized or treated as a powerless figurehead. She wrote letters to her son constantly, not the sweet, encouraging notes that a typical mother might send to a son fighting distant wars, but detailed political briefings laced with supernatural omens, religious interpretations, and barely concealed venom toward anyone she perceived as a threat to Alexander's interests or her own influence.
And Alexander, despite being thousands of miles away, commanding vast armies and conquering ancient civilizations, read every single word she sent him. Her correspondence carried more weight in his decision-making than the advice of his closest military commanders, his most trusted political advisors, or even his own direct observations of local conditions. She constantly reminded him who his true enemies were, both foreign and domestic. She questioned the loyalty of his longtime companions, suggesting that success and wealth had corrupted their original dedication to his cause. She criticized his growing fascination with Persian customs and administrative practices, arguing that adopting foreign ways would weaken his connection to the Macedonian gods who had granted him victory after victory. She disapproved of his political marriages to foreign princesses, seeing them as unnecessary compromises that diluted the purity of his bloodline and introduced potential rivals into the royal household. Most controversially, she criticized his increasingly public flirtation with claiming divine status for himself, warning that such pretensions might anger the very gods whose favor had made his conquests possible. No one else in Alexander's inner circle dared to speak so directly or challenge his decisions so bluntly, but Olympias had never been afraid to assert her authority as both his mother and a priestess of divine will. She had given him life, guided his early political education, and cleared his path to the throne through methods that others found disturbingly effective. Back in Macedonia, her relationship with Antipater grew increasingly hostile and destructive. She undermined his authority at every opportunity, using her royal status, her religious authority, and her extensive family connections to stir up political opposition against him. She maintained influence in Epirus, Thessaly, and among various aristocratic families throughout the region, giving her a network of supporters who could spread rumors, create administrative difficulties, and generally make Antipater's life as regent extremely complicated and frustrating. She could spread politically damaging stories faster than wildfire. And when Olympias whispered that someone was disloyal, incompetent, or dangerous, those whispers had a tendency to become accepted truth remarkably quickly. With her, a carefully placed rumor could be deadlier than a sword thrust, and she wielded gossip like a master craftsman wielding a precision instrument. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander became increasingly urgent and paranoid. She warned him repeatedly about Antipater's growing ambitions, painting him as a would-be usurper in the mold of Philip II, ready to betray his king and seize power for himself the moment an opportunity presented itself. Whether she genuinely believed these accusations or was simply expressing her fear of losing her own political influence, she kept pressing Alexander to take decisive action against the man she saw as her primary rival for control of the Macedonian homeland. Alexander, however, found himself caught in an impossible political situation. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece and Macedonia while he fought campaigns thousands of miles away in Asia. Removing or replacing him would require finding someone equally experienced, competent, and trustworthy. No easy task when most of his best commanders were already serving with the army in its ongoing conquest of the Persian Empire. So the rift between his mother and his regent continued to widen, creating a source of ongoing political tension that Alexander could never fully resolve to anyone's satisfaction. Olympias watched from her position of unofficial power, growing increasingly impatient with what she saw as her son's reluctance to deal decisively with domestic threats to his reign. She hadn't endured decades of palace warfare, political manipulation, and carefully calculated violence, only to be ruled over by an aging soldier whose loyalty she questioned and whose competence she doubted. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, and as his victories made him the most powerful ruler in the known world, Olympias began to see dangerous cracks forming in the foundation of everything she had built.
And with that, we reach the end of our journey through some of history's darkest corners. We walked alongside medieval assassins as they crept through shadowy alleyways, understanding why their lives were far more desperate and brutal than any romantic legend would have us believe. We've witnessed Olympias wielding motherhood and prophecy like weapons in the marble halls of ancient Macedonia, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. We've wandered through the labyrinthine corridors of Knossos, feeling the weight of mysteries that remain unsolved after thousands of years, questioning whether we're walking through a palace, a temple, or perhaps something that was both and neither. And we've stood in the shadow of ancient siege engines, those magnificent and terrible machines that could reduce the strongest walls to rubble and the proudest cities to surrender. Throughout this exploration, we've seen a common thread: the gap between myth and reality, between the stories we tell ourselves about the past and the often harsher truths that archaeology and careful historical research reveal. Medieval assassins weren't romantic figures of legend. They were desperate people driven to violence by circumstances beyond their control. Olympias wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a political operator whose ruthless brilliance shaped one of history's greatest empires. Knossos wasn't just a palace. It was a civilization's attempt to build something approaching paradise, which ultimately crumbled like all earthly paradise must. These stories matter because they remind us that human nature, in all its complexity, cruelty, brilliance, and mystery, hasn't changed as much as we might like to believe. The tools evolve, the settings shift, but the fundamental drives that led someone to become a hired killer in medieval Europe, or convinced a Macedonian queen to orchestrate political murders, or inspired Bronze Age architects to build impossible labyrinths, those drives are still with us. We still live in a world where desperation can drive people to violence, where political power demands impossible choices, where we build beautiful things that we know won't last forever, and where we create weapons capable of destroying everything we claim to value. The names change, the technology advances, but the human drama continues to play out in remarkably similar patterns. Perhaps that's why these dark corners of history continue to fascinate us. They're mirrors, reflecting back aspects of ourselves that we'd rather not acknowledge, but can't quite ignore. In the medieval assassin's isolation and desperation, we might recognize our own loneliness and the compromises we make to survive. In Olympias's fierce protection of her family's interests, we see the lengths to which we might go to protect the people we love. In the Minoan's beautiful, mysterious civilization, we see our own attempts to create meaning and beauty in a world that seems determined to destroy both. And in the ancient siege engines, we see humanity's eternal paradox, our incredible capacity for both creation and destruction, often expressed in the same breath, sometimes literally in the same machine. I hope tonight's journey has given you something to think about as you go about your own life. Maybe a new appreciation for the complexity of historical truth, or a deeper understanding of how the past continues to shape the present, or simply the satisfaction of exploring some fascinating stories that don't always make it into the standard history books. Remember, history isn't just about memorizing dates and names.
It's about understanding the human experience across time, recognizing the patterns that connect us to people who lived centuries or millennia ago, and perhaps gaining some insight into our own place in the long, strange story of human civilization. The medieval assassins are gone, their names forgotten, their secrets buried with their bones. Olympias died in exile, her empire reduced to dust, her serpents long since returned to the earth. The Minoans vanished so completely that we still can't read their writing or fully understand their culture. The great siege engines were replaced by gunpowder, then by modern artillery, then by weapons that would have seemed like magic to the ancient engineers who first figured out how to turn physics into a tool of war. But their stories remain, preserved in fragments of text, archaeological evidence, and the myths that grew up around them. And as long as we continue to tell these stories, to explore these dark corners, to ask these difficult questions about what it means to be human, some part of them continues to live. So thank you for joining me on this exploration. Thank you for your curiosity, your patience, and your willingness to venture into places where the light doesn't always reveal comfortable truths. Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep looking for the real stories behind the legends. The world is full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered, full of dark corners that still hold secrets, full of human stories that deserve to be remembered, even when, or perhaps especially when, they make us uncomfortable. Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your questions sharper, and remember that the most interesting truths are usually the ones that challenge everything you thought you knew. Good night, and sweet dreams. Try not to think too much about medieval assassins lurking in the shadows, ancient queens plotting in marble halls, or the fact that somewhere out there, new mysteries are being buried even as old ones are finally coming to light. Sleep well, wherever you are in this strange and wonderful world.